For our COBT viewers and listeners, it's Maynard, Mike, and Brett here with something we've been looking to do for a few weeks now, and we finally got it lined up. Brett, along with Patrick White and Nicholas McMurray, Patrick of the Clean Air Task Force and Niko of ClearPath, the three of them worked together on a memo outlining what they thought would be good changes in our nuclear regulatory framework, in particular around smaller nuclear devices. They'll get into it, but it's an important piece of the nuclear regulatory framework, one that we think is very important to innovation, to driving nuclear. There is a lot to talk about in the nuclear regulatory space, and we're going to use, guys, the paper you put out, we're going to use it as an excuse to not just talk about the paper, but talk about broadly what's been happening in nuclear. It is the hot flavor right now. So let me just pause and say, Patrick and Niko, we're delighted to have you. Brett, we're of course delighted to have you as well.
Thank you, Maynard.
Yeah, excited to be here.
I didn't do you guys' bio enough justice. There's enough degrees and scientific knowledge and experience in there to last many lifetimes. So I'll hit on those as we talk further with you. But suffice to say, these guys have been doing nuclear and nuclear policy, all aspects of it, for quite a long time. Mike, the world is, holy smokes. What are you going to tell us?
You know what? Just looking at the markets right now, obviously everyone knows that crude oil has moved up about $10 since early last week on the whole Iranian-Israeli conflict that's going on. But I think what's interesting, we can kind of get away from that and not predict where prices are going to go. I mean, right now, I think most people would say that market fundamentals in the second half of this year and into 2026, we are in a basically S&D surplus. And so prices will probably head lower. Obviously, that was a very consensus view. A lot of people got stopped out. And so I think what we need to really be focusing on, I think Arjun's done a really good job at this, is maybe thinking more about not the next 2 or 3 weeks, but maybe the next 2 or 3, 4 years, what that means. And interestingly enough, the IEA came out today and basically said that in 2027, China's oil demand is going to be peaking. In 2029, oil demand globally is going to be peaking. Now, contrast that to OPEC, that's talking about somewhere in the 2040s. So big gap there. And I think the important thing is all the stuff that's going on the supply side, yeah, that's going to affect prices, but demand is going to be the key, right? What is demand going to look like over the next 5 or 6 years? Obviously, if OPEC is right and demand keeps growing to 2040, that's going to basically put an upward bias to crude oil, maybe not in the next 6, 9, 12 months, but over the next 4, 5, 6, 7 years. So we're kind of watching that. So it's something we saw in the crude oil pits today. I think from the standpoint of bonds, bonds tomorrow is going to be the FOMC rate decision meeting. Most people expect that the Fed is not going to do anything. They're going to leave rates unchanged. Obviously expect Trump is going to come out post that and basically get all over them and say they should be lowering rates or they're killing our economy, whatever the case may be. Consensus is it's going to be unchanged, and I think consensus is they're going to make their first cut probably in the September timeframe. I'd say from an energy market standpoint, instead of just talking about stocks, the stocks have outperformed just recently, but I'd say that people were very bearish energy equities to begin with. Crude moving up $10, that was obviously going to squeeze people. That has squeezed people. But we're just not seeing long-only people saying, okay, we're coming back into this market.
And Mike, when you're saying energy equities, you're really talking about oil-tied
Yeah,
equities.
oil-tied. I mean, obviously the gas equities continue to outperform. And so,
or power, and there's a whole other world, yeah.
Exactly. And so we're not seeing people coming back to oil equities. People are still really in the nuclear names, they're still in the power names, and they're still in the natural gas names. On that front, I'd say two things that really interested us this week in energy is two events. One, ADNOC is looking to take over Santos, roughly $20 billion. Santos is an Australian producer, oil and gas assets around the world, but they really have an LNG focus, and I think that's where ADNOC is looking at that company. The second thing is this news the other day, the rumors that Mitsubishi is looking to buy Aethon Energy, which is a Haynesville gas player. Rumors were a couple months ago that ADNOC was also interested in that company. So that just kind of proves to you that LNG and natural gas, some of the biggest players in the world, that is still of interest to them. The last thing we'd say, and maybe we can talk about it today, is that, the big, beautiful bill that's now in the Senate, it looks like we're getting some idea of what they're looking from the standpoint of solar and some of these tax credits and whatever the case may be. The Senate, some people thought they were going to maybe reverse back a little. It looks like they're being just as bad from a tax credit standpoint. It looks like they're looking to phase these things out by 2028. The solar stocks today, wind stocks, are anywhere down from 20 to 30 to 40% today on that news. And so hopefully we'll talk about this, but those names continue to be under pressure. There were some hopes that, the bill wouldn't be as bad, but it looks like it's just as bad. But now the credits for hydrogen, nuclear, geothermal, it looks like those are going to be extended to 2036. So you know what, man, we'll just leave it there and hand it back to you.
So much going on, guys. Patrick and Niko, you guys have spent so much time in nuclear. Brett, you obviously as well. You can see why with a lead in like that, we enjoy spending time in energy. It always keeps you guessing and surprising, and it's full of all sorts of variables. Washington, D.C., nuclear regulation. I mean, this is, you guys are close to the center of the universe right now in terms of what people are watching, what people are talking about, what could have dramatic effects over the next decade. I want to stop talking. Brett, tell us how you met these two guys and how the three of you said, you know what, let's lean into this and start speaking publicly about the need for some better regulation.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Maynard. I'm super excited about this conversation because Patrick and Niko and I have been friends and been talking about nuclear discussions for almost, I'd say, close to 10 years at this point. And so it's great to kind of feel like we've brought that into the Veritin family now a little bit too. So Niko and I met first during my time at Clean Air Task Force when we used to spend a lot more time banging on doors in Congress and visiting. We used to call it the lunchtime shuffle, going to see, congressional staff and Senate staff every 30 minutes and running through the halls together to make a next meeting and everything. And Patrick joined the Nuclear Innovation Alliance, which was another, another nuclear-focused NGO a few years after Niko joined ClearPath. And so we quickly became thick as thieves, stuck on phone calls together, running through these halls, really trying to have the discussions that I think are bearing a lot of fruit now today. So Patrick and Niko has since moved on at ClearPath to be more than focused on just nuclear and nuclear policy. Our brightest birds always fly away, right? And everything. And Patrick has sidestepped to Clean Air Task Force, where I used to be, but we still talk all the time, and that's kind of how this work together kind of got started end of last year.
No, it's great. And guys, as we turn to you, I think what we've come to appreciate through Brett, but also just, I think, Mike, over the last 3, 4, 5 years, we've had a lot more interaction with Washington, a lot more interaction with Washington think tanks. I don't want to mischaracterize it, but you're both pro-nuclear organizations. You're both very focused on energy and environmental issues. You come at it from slightly different sides of the aisle. I don't want to overstate it, but you've connected in this centrist way around nuclear, which is one observation that's always interesting about nuclear. It is drawing support from both sides of the aisle, and you guys working together is slightly a bit of a metaphor for that. It's the energy source that's bringing people together. Brett, maybe I just came up with a new tagline, but Patrick, why don't I start with you? Tell us about the Clean Air Task Force and how you guys, you've been a pro-nuclear for a while, but how you're leaning into nuclear, what you want to see change, just like what is the discussion at CATF right now around nuclear?
Yeah, thanks so much. So when you talk about Clean Air Task Force, it's a think tank that's really focused on what are the different clean energy solutions that can help our society and really our world transform. And so it's looking at not just nuclear, but thinking about things like geothermal, carbon capture, other clean energy technologies. There are maybe going to be those really interesting technology approaches that ultimately get us to clean, affordable, reliable energy. And so nuclear has always been one of those technologies that CATF has been involved in. Brett actually was in my role several years ago, so it's great to see it really come full circle there. And so at CATF, what we're really interested in is what are the policies and who can we really kind of bring together to start seeing nuclear playing a much larger role in our energy system of the future. What does it mean in terms of who are the commercial players? Who are the developers? What's the policy? And then what's the regulation? And so CATF works really kind of across the aisle and across the country and the world to try to identify these opportunities and figure out how we can move the ball forward. One of the really interesting CATF programs is something called the Nuclear Scaling Initiative, where we're working with the NTI, the Nuclear Threat Initiative, and EFI, the Energy Futures Initiative, to really figure out how can we bring a coalition of stakeholders together to not just build one nuclear plant, but what does it mean to actually build out an order book and really see us deploy nuclear at scale. And so I think that's really kind of the perspective of CATF is how can we really have nuclear play a major role in what clean energy looks like in the next 10 years, the next 20 years, and the next 100 years.
So I'm thinking, Niko, as we jump to you, and I really did, your backgrounds are very impressive, but just to pause on it, Patrick, you've got a master's and a Ph.D. in nuclear science and engineering from MIT. You're an undergrad, bachelor's and master's mechanical engineering, Carnegie Mellon. And then Niko, you were at the Ohio State University Bachelor of Science in Materials Science and Engineering. And the reason I wanted to highlight that, other than impressing your relatives, reminding your relatives of your accomplishments, is to be an advocate for nuclear, you have to know what you're talking about. And not that you don't need to in other areas, but what we've observed in energy for a long time is it's complicated. And so you got to know your stuff if you're going to get other people comfortable with all the details. So with that as background, Niko, I also should have mentioned you worked at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. In the lead-in, I think Mike and I were sharing, we view the NRC as maybe the most mysterious regulatory black box on the planet. I don't mean that in a bad way. It's just like it sounds daunting to walk in with an application and slide it in the window and say, can I please build a nuclear plant? What's your perspective from ClearPath on nuclear, and how are you working, kind of like Patrick was describing, with a lot of others around all this?
Yeah, thank you, Bader. Hopefully after today, we'll demystify some of those questions around the NRC. And I think, to your point of really understanding the different processes, really a big reason why we put together this letter, because we think it's a great opportunity to kind of build upon a lot of the work that the NRC already has done to make it easier to build a lot of these new technologies. But to your question on ClearPath, so ClearPath is a DC-based policy and advocacy organization broadly focused on clean energy and industrial decarbonization. Work on nuclear power, but also a wide suite of other technologies in the power sector, heavy industry, and kind of carbon innovation. And then those cross-cutting policies like tax policy, permitting, international exports, et cetera. And so we really try to look very holistically of what are the different policies to help commercialize some of these different new technologies. So we're looking at the basic research and development. We're looking at demonstrations. We see permitting as a big piece of that. The nuclear part is also, very much intertwined with what does it take to build some of these new technologies. Some of the different deployment incentives, Patrick mentioned building that order book. So how do you really bring down those costs for early movers? And then ultimately also trying to look at how can the US lead in these technologies globally? And what are those policies to help the export of different technologies such as nuclear energy? And so as we're looking at kind of, aligning the regulatory framework for nuclear for these new technologies, have to take a step back and really realize that the current regulatory framework is built around large light water reactors. It was built that way over decades of operating experience to actually create a lot of predictability to build large light water reactors. And so, that's a good thing. And that's really why the regulations have grown how they have. That's why we have the different processes that we do. The challenge is now you have, dozens of these new technologies that are smaller. They use different fuels. They use different coolants. they justify safety in different ways. And so trying to match up the current regulatory framework with these new technologies is an area that, I think about a lot. I know Patrick and Brett think about a lot, to really make sure that the regulations are aligned with these new technologies, that they credit some of these innovations in safety or innovations in new technologies, because ultimately you want a predictable framework, you want a straightforward framework, and hopefully where it's not this overly mysterious framework that creates uncertainty for a company that is looking to get a license, or an investor that's looking to invest in a technology or project to get it producing electricity.
So guys, and we'll attach the paper that the three of you put out. And I guess I would say thank you, not to sound hokey, but thank you for putting it out, because when people lean into stuff and make real suggestions, I think it obviously makes the conversation better. One of the pivot points looking at the paper that you talk about is and I might just ask one of you to explain, you've got the class 103 license and the class 104 license. And then within those, there are reactors which are really about power, and then there are others about other uses, heat, et cetera. Would you mind, and I'll just throw it to the nuclear scrum here, could one of you just talk about those couple of distinctions and why you chose that particular box, the non-power 103 license, to write this paper about?
Yeah, happy to dive into the definitions on that one. So I think one of the things that you see here is similar to what Niko said, how a regulatory system will evolve over the course of 7 decades, and how we go from maybe what was initially envisioned in the 50s to what we have now. And that really, I think, ultimately leads into this idea of what are these different classes of reactors and different types of reactors. So the first one that you spoke about, this 103, 104, are definitions of commercial and non-commercial reactors within essentially the atomic energy, the legislation that oversees all nuclear regulation in the United States. The idea was that for a class 104 reactor, these were reactors that were going to be licensed by the Atomic Energy Commission and now the Nuclear Regulatory Commission for either medical uses, if you're using a reactor for medical therapies to help treat different patients or for diagnostic purposes, or for essentially research and testing purposes. What would it mean for a university or a private company to have a small reactor that they're doing research and development? The idea is that these weren't being necessarily operated commercially to make a profit if they were a research or test reactor, or if they were a medical reactor, they're being developed for a very specific purpose. Those are in contrast to the 103 reactors, which were your kind of traditional commercial reactors. And these are things that were being operated to sell commercial products to the grid or to other customers, and ultimately were kind of seen as commercial reactors for commercial purposes. And so these kind of developed as 2 separate ways to think about the types of reactors that the United States would be building and developing. Well, in parallel to that, we had another set of distinctions that were being made by the regulator between power and non-power reactors. And this can be a little bit of a confusing definition, because many people think, well, any reactor that operates is going to produce some power. What are you going to do with it? But when the NRC said power and non-power, it really came to the idea of, are these very large reactors that need the full suite of regulatory requirements and oversight, or are these going to be smaller reactors where a simpler set of regulations might be appropriate? And the idea was big reactors are power reactors. They need the full set of regulatory requirements and regulatory oversight. Small reactors, well, they're not producing electrical power to the grid or large amounts of electrical power to the grid. So there's something different. We'll call them non-power reactors. And so while this made a lot of sense in the 1950s, over time, these terms started to merge, where people thought a class 103 reactor was always a power reactor and a class 104 reactor was always a non-power reactor. Because similar to what Niko said, we started only building those large light water reactors commercially. And so this led to essentially these 2 separate sets of definitions where they became synonymous, but in reality, they're completely separate. So from our perspective, what we were really interested in was how could you operate a reactor commercially, the idea of that 103 reactor, but also apply the rules that were initially designed and optimized for those much smaller reactors, the non-power reactors. And so how could you try to match the appropriate regulatory requirements for commercial purposes for much smaller reactors that might have a much simpler safety case? And that's what kind of led to the letter here of trying to really explain what these 2 different sets of terms are and how there's actually a lot more overlap that can be beneficial than might appear at first glance.
So guys, let's say I'm a customer somewhere who would like a small, for commercial purposes, nuclear reactor, and my primary focus, I'm not going to be, I'll let you guys make the power distinction, but I would like to buy a small, this sounds like an absurd example, but I would like to buy a small 103 class nuclear reactor. What sort of regulations do you think I should be subjected to, or should the manufacturer be subjected to? Like, help our audience understand what sort of framework you think that customer / producer should go through.
Yeah, and the question you're asking, Maynard, is not a hypothetical. This is what companies are very interested in, because they're developing these new technologies that are, again, looking at safety in different ways. They're looking at different fuels and coolants that are different than what is currently written in the regulations. And so having the appropriate set of regulations really is the goal. And then also making sure that process is predictable. And so this question has been being worked on for the last couple of years, where the NRC has been making changes to its regulatory processing and rules such as emergency planning and security and siting. But what really happened this past January, and also as part of the impetus for this letter, is the NRC completed a rulemaking specifically around these non-power reactors, specifically around kind of the research and test reactors that, again, a university may be building. And what they did is they changed a definition. And they changed actually the definition in the regulatory, 10 CFR Part 50 for non-power reactor to be much more performance-based. And so they specifically called out, you can be a non-power reactor if you're a research reactor, a testing facility, or a commercial facility. And so what they actually did is they tied that last piece of a commercial or industrial reactor, which is analogous to that 103, class 103 license, to a dose. So they made it, very much performance-based. And what that did is really clarified, how you could create what you were saying, a small reactor that can justify that it's, very safe to fit into that box. And then to Patrick's point, it tied the broader set of regulatory requirements that already exist to be applicable for that reactor. And that, again, it goes to things like some of the human factors requirements that are very specific in the regulations, things like how the role of probabilistic risk assessments are used or PRA are used. And so there is a very clear pathway for licensing a research reactor. The NRC has actually just done it with, like HIROS Hermes reactors in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and the Abilene Christian University molten salt test or research reactor, in Texas. And so the NRC has these processes. They have these clear requirements, and they've just clarified that these can be used if you meet a certain dose requirement for, again, a very small reactor.
And guys, for those of us on the outside looking in here, why do it, or talk to us about a dose and talking about it in those terms versus saying, 50 megawatts and below, or trying to use some sort of power or output type measure? Like, was there a debate there? Is there an equivalency there? Like, how should we think about, translate dose into language that the rest of us might understand better?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think historically, when we thought about only building one type of reactor where they all looked pretty similar, you could come up with rough correlations to say, as the reactor grows in size, how do the potential hazards and consequences of an accident also scale by the size of the reactor? And so there were really simple rules of thumb that you could use. As your reactor went from 200 megawatts to 400 megawatts up to 1,000 megawatts, how do you need to think about the safety of it? But one of the things that we're seeing with a lot of these new technologies and some of the advanced reactors that are under development is that because we're using some of the new fuels, some of the new coolants, new design features, new operations, we're suddenly starting to decouple the idea of reactor size and reactor safety. It's not just the number of megawatts that it uses or the number of megawatts that it produces. It's more about how does the overall safety of the plant potentially affect the public, workers, and the environment during all possible accident conditions. And so the idea here was, instead of trying to come up with a rough metric that might be inaccurate or might not reflect the innovation that's going on in the space, let's instead focus on a metric that really helps us assess, is this going to be a potential risk to public health and safety in the future? And so the idea of using a radiation dose metric in this way is, how can we tie it to the way that the NRC and other organizations think about radiation safety, to make sure that even during a kind of a maximum credible accident, or the accident you think that could really happen at the site, we're not going to endanger people that aren't that are essentially living nearby. So the dose limit that Niko was talking about, that was ultimately selected as part of this updated rulemaking, is what we call the 1 rem offsite dose limit. And what's really significant about this 1 rem offsite dose is that ends up being the cutoff for emergency evacuations or other offsite emergency planning during any type of accident. So really what this rule is saying is that if you can build a facility that during any accident conditions doesn't require any type of evacuation, shelter in place, or other offsite activities, then that reactor is so safe it should be subject to a simplified set of regulatory requirements. And that's really where we see kind of that break between just using power, megawatts, that we've normally talked about, and why going to kind of a performance-based standard like Niko talked about with dose is really kind of the right approach.
Okay, this is awesome, guys. And I got that expression, maximum credible accident. How do you determine that? I'm imagining the form and I'm turning it in and I would like approval, and then it says, please describe the maximum credible accident and whether or not what it engenders. How do you come up with the maximum credible accident?
Maybe I'll jump in here on this.
Get on in here, Rampage.
So, Maynard, coming up with the maximum credible accident, or coming up with what we might call the main safety case for any of these reactor designs is, the reason why I sometimes feel like I am one of the most ignorant nuclear engineers I know, because nuclear engineers put their heads down, spend years and decades, analyzing and thinking about technologies. Also, we took many of these technologies at some point, built them in the lab, and did very strange things to them that perturb the reactor in a way that might cause what we now see as the maximum credible accident for that particular design or that particular family of reactors. We also have this broad experience base of operating some of these reactors, both the existing fleet of light water reactors, a very broad base, but then a somewhat usable commercial base around some of these future technologies that we're trying to deploy right now. They have, in some cases, operated commercially in this country before. So building on the shoulders of giants in many ways is how folks are coming up with what these maximum credible accidents are, and then being conservative, informed nuclear engineers and mechanical and electrical engineers. Many times we would call it using engineering judgment. What's the most limiting or most, sort of reactive way and configuration we could have the reactor in before we did the worst thing we could think of to it? Cut a steam line, full break, just done off immediately. Call it a guillotine break of the steam line. And so that becomes sort of the broad, high-end, kind of maximum credible accident that if we can say, hey, this occurs and our reactor is still safe and the public is still safe, then there should be a really, really strong regulatory case for this sort of product moving forward.
Oh, if I can just build on that, I think one of the other really important things here is to remember that regulation, and this might be frustrating to some of the engineers listening, is not a purely technical process. It's a technical and it's a social process. It's working with the regulator, it's working with the applicant to really say, what do we understand about your system? And what's essentially the data that backs up your understanding of what is the maximum credible accident, or what are the things that can go wrong in your reactor, and what are the steps that you're taking to ensure safety? That's also one of the things that I think Niko talked about a little bit earlier in terms of predictability, is that it's trying to figure out how do we build up the experience at the regulator, the experience among applicants, so they can reach consensus on what that is. For the very first time you bring a reactor technology forward, if it looks nothing like what the NRC has ever seen, well, that process might take a little bit longer to kind of reach consensus, look at the data, and understand what that credible accident is. But the goal is, can we build a system that when you're bringing not the first reactor, but the 100th reactor through, there's a really clear understanding, and that process becomes incredibly predictable. And so it is a bit of a technical, and I would say a little bit of a social negotiation there.
Even though we're calling this, this is sort of the small reactor line that you're trying to get in here for commercial purposes, and we're calling it non-power, isn't still the most logical case for one of these things going to be power, or do you see it as a lot of other things? Like talk to us about the use case you see happening in this line, if you will.
Yeah, and I think that's unfortunately where some of this terminology is confusing, where, as Patrick was saying, as the language evolved of the term non-power reactor was originally really focused on those research reactors, those testing facilities. However, it's this recent change in the regulations that really opened up the term non-power reactor to be something that is commercial. Absolutely would produce power, absolutely would produce heat. However, it's that terminology that is a little bit confusing. And so that's really where we wanted to, recommend to the NRC, how would this actually work in practice? Because some of the terminology is confusing, and there's a lot of other regulatory requirements that want to make sure are aligned with this updated process and this updated framework. And so we really recommended that the NRC actually try to run through a potential application to make sure there are no undue barriers to be able to license what we're terming a commercial non-power reactor with the requirements that already exist for what is used for those smaller reactors. And so that's really the takeaway, is this is a little confusing, and the path is actually pretty clear in the sense that we know what the regulatory requirements are. We know what an applicant would have to meet, because the NRC licenses these small reactors all the time. And then kind of the other last part, none of this is also really new, this use around like dose and a performance-based metric. Congress has actually been very clear to the NRC, going back to the Nuclear Energy Innovation and Modernization Act, to be more performance-based in their requirements. And so the NRC has had a number of different changes and rulemakings to make its requirements more performance-based. Patrick mentioned the emergency planning requirements. That's one of the recommendations in the letter, is to make sure those two metrics of that 1 rem at the site boundary are aligned with what the cutoff of that 1 rem is for this commercial non-power reactor. Another really good example is actually around environmental reviews and meeting NEPA, where the NRC is going through creating a generic environmental impact statement, where it's trying to treat most all of those requirements as generic for reactors that can stay in a certain performance envelope. That initial version was tied to reactor size, and the NRC actually changed its position based on feedback from different stakeholders to make it much more performance-based. So it would be based on what is the actual impact to the environment of a reactor. And so the NRC has been doing this. And I think this is another really good example where the NRC is trying to create a more performance-based regulatory framework, because that does create a lot more predictability for what does an applicant have to meet? What is the metric that the applicant has to meet and justify in order to get a license?
Yeah, I know. Early in the lead-in, we talked about these the big beautiful bill. Obviously, solar and wind got gutted. It looks like people were holding out hope that the Senate would basically come back a little bit on that. It looks like they're gutting it as well, and so those stocks are down quite significantly today, and they have been over the last 12, 18 months. And so I would say that, basically capital is not flowing to those names, or won't be flowing to those names. On the other hand, you see some of these SMR stocks are up anywhere from 100 to 200% this year, 300 or 400% over the last 2 years. So I would say that capital would like and is flowing to those companies. And I guess my question is that I understand the NRC is all about safety, 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 but electricity growth in the U.S. is not slowing down. You've taken a big chunk of that and probably slowed it down in the form of wind and solar. So I guess my question is, the culture at the NRC seems to me to be all about safety, but we have to now shift into a speed mode here. And so I think when I talk to people in the industry, they're saying the NRC is so ingrained with this safety mentality. Getting over to a sort of a speed to market mentality is very difficult, and you almost have to revamp the whole organization. Maybe give some thoughts of being in there internally. Is that too crazy? Is the culture one where you have to shift it, and so you have to move people out? I'm just trying to understand how you see it, both from the inside and where we need to be by 2030.
Yeah, definitely from my time there, where I had the opportunity to be working on, the new reactor technologies that were under development. So kind of that initial core team really thinking about what will the NRC have to do to license a lot of these technologies. And you've seen where the NRC has been making progress in a number of different areas to, streamline or clarify those requirements to make sure they're more appropriate for new designs. I think one of the big challenges is the NRC is a large organization, and so it does take time to kind of move everything. The NRC also has a lot of different areas of focus. We're here talking about new reactors. The NRC is also focused on operating reactors. There's an interest in power uprates and license extensions, and so a big part of the agency is going to have to be focused on that. It's also focused on medical isotopes and a lot of those areas, and so the NRC has a very wide purview. And so, that change in culture takes time, but also making sure that the NRC has the right staff, has the right technical ability, and in some cases has the right direction from Congress is really important to be able to make those changes. And so, going back to the letter that we sent, we wanted to make sure that the NRC could improve its regulatory process, could clarify, the path for a reactor that is, able to meet a performance-based dose metric in a way that doesn't require a holistic change to the regulations. It does not require a significant rulemaking that can take a long period of time, because we do see this opportunity for speed to market. And so it's, ideas like this, it's other, creative ideas from a lot of other organizations who are thinking about how to improve the regulatory framework can actually help minimize some of those barriers that are either real or perceived at the regulator. So a company can actually make those investment decisions. They can actually know what requirements they have to meet, and they can go to the regulator, they can submit an application, and they are able to justify what does it actually take to get a license.
And I think just building on that, I mean, I didn't have a chance to work at the NRC, but that was actually my master's and Ph.D. at MIT, was looking at nuclear regulation and how to do it more effectively. And I think Niko's right on the money with that. It's really thinking about how we can help the NRC complete their safety mission, but do it in a way that's more effective, more efficient, and more predictable. We still need to make sure we have an independent safety regulator in the United States, but how can we think about their processes and how can we think about their culture to make it more efficient? And a lot of this, I think, comes from both having high quality applicants, people that are bringing projects that are well thought out, that have a firm documentation, but then also really trying to make sure the NRC staff have the resources and direction, like Niko talked about, to complete these reviews. I think it can also be really challenging because we're looking at 5 data points and trying to make a line of how the NRC is changing this organization. But I would even say with the few data points that we have, we're seeing some good changes over there. It's not like the NRC is a static organization or one that's getting worse. So the couple of examples that I point to right off the bat, the company Kairos Power is looking at building 3 test reactors right now outside of Oak Ridge, Tennessee. And they were able to move through the licensing process for their Hermes 1 and Hermes 2 reactor in record time, because they worked really well with the agency and they had a clear understanding of what do we need to do to demonstrate the safety of our reactor, and what things are you going to be looking for when we bring an application to you. We also then have even seen it on the commercial side as well.
Patrick,
yes,
I'm sorry
please
for interrupting you. Before you move on from Kairos, if you pull the milestones on the Hermes 1 versus Hermes 2, 30 to 40% time improvement between every milestone on the first and second sort of application and license that they got to proceed with construction of these projects. So
that's a perfect example, Brett.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, it's actual learning by doing. The NRC is saying we're reviewing the same application. Let's simplify the review, check for any changes, but move a heck of a lot faster with it. And even if we just look to some news that broke last week, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission published the review schedule for the X Energy project with Dow Chemical down in Texas. And they said that they're going to be able to review or perform the safety review of that reactor in only 18 months, and then also use simplified environmental review processes to do it more efficiently as well. For the first time ever for a commercial reactor, they're going to be using an environmental assessment instead of a full environmental impact statement, because they've looked at the reactor, they've talked with the applicant, and they've said, yeah, we think a simplified environmental review is going to let us move faster and still meet all of our regulatory requirements. And so I think if you had said years ago, oh, the NRC is going to be providing a construction permit for a first of a kind nuclear reactor in 18 months, people would have laughed at you and said, there's no way the NRC could pull that off. But we are seeing some of these changes that show that the NRC is going in the right direction. I think the question is, how do we kind of keep the pressure on and make sure that they're getting the support and resources they need to keep that transformation going?
So guys, one question on the NRC itself. I could have this number wrong, but if you just pull it up, how many people are in the NRC? ChatGPT will tell you about 3,000. That doesn't seem like a lot by government regulatory standards. I don't know what, Mike, you would have guessed, but I would have had a lot more than 3,000. So maybe just tell us about the people and the resources. I know you guys aren't working at the NRC, but tell us about the organization a little bit. And also, is the NRC, would you say the attitude right now is, oh, happy day, you know, the world loves nuclear again, everybody's going to pay attention to us, and finally, you know, the flavor that we regulate is getting renewed interest? Or is it closer to, oh my gosh, the whole world is all over us to speed it up, make it better, get it done faster, and, you know, we don't have a ton of people. Like, maybe just tell us some more about the NRC, because it's not an agency or a regulatory group that we know that well, at least not like you guys.
I'll give a couple perspectives there. I mean, a lot of the staff at the NRC have a technical background, whether an engineering or a science background. And so
this is good news, Niko. This is very good news.
In my discipline, you know,
if you'd said they're all English majors, I'd have been worried.
But they do have a wide focus of what they're, you know, looking at. You have, you know, licensing experts, you have project managers, you have inspectors, you have that entire world around different materials for, you know, cancer treatment and things like that on the medical side. Like, the NRC has a wide focus of, you know, what it has to look at. You know, I think on the reactor side, especially when I was there, I think it was an interest in, you know, how do you kind of rise to this new opportunity? You have this renewed interest of new technologies. And so how do you really start to think differently around, you know, what are the right regulatory requirements? And, you know, your comment on kind of maybe an unexpected size of the agency, I think that's also really where you want to make sure those staff resources are focused on the right topics. And so you want to make sure the staff are focused on things that are actually important to safety. So they're not, you know, wasting their time on something that's not important to safety. They're also not wasting the applicant's time and money on something that's not important to safety. And so the more that you can create kind of these clearer outcomes and these clearer pathways, have a lot of benefit for industry, obviously, but also have a lot of benefit for the technical staff, because you really do want them to be focusing their time on what matters. You know, using, you know, both the Kairos example and then X Energy, the staff, you know, through those processes would have had to realize, what do they actually need to look at? They already looked at, you know, the first Kairos Hermes application. And so they didn't have to go through everything in depth again for the second one. For X Energy, it was, well, you're building this facility at an industrial site. So do you actually need to do the full environmental review, as opposed to something else that still ensures environmental compliance, but doesn't require, you know, all of those additional resources? And so that's really where, you know, thinking creatively about the regulatory framework, thinking about the appropriate regulatory requirements can have, of course, again, a lot of benefits for companies who are looking to build reactors, but also a lot of benefit for the agency. And I think the last point to that is you've seen this support from Congress for the NRC. You've seen bipartisan support for the last several years, most recently last year with the enactment of the Advance Act, which had overwhelming bipartisan support. And so you really are seeing Congress saying, hey, NRC, we're trying to give you some of the tools, we're trying to give you some of the clarity and some of the direction to really help you and the staff rise to that occasion. Because ultimately, that's what the industry needs. That's what the NRC needs, because you have to make sure that you can license these reactors. It's efficient, it's effective, it's predictable. And the only way to do that in some cases is just removing some of those barriers where Congress has that opportunity to do that, but also different organizations to try to provide, feedback and ideas to help the NRC, think differently or be able to implement a process in a new way.
And I think to your question about culture, again, no organization is fully homogenous, and I won't speak for any or all NRC staff, but I would say that the ones that I speak with and the ones that I work with on a daily and weekly basis, they're really interested in the role that they're playing in thinking about the future of energy and even other uses of radioactive material in the United States. I think there's sometimes this perception that the NRC only cares about safety and that they're going to try to get safety above anything else. And the answer is no, they're a safety-focused organization, but they also understand the role that they can play in trying to enable the safe use of nuclear material, enable the use of nuclear energy, and that they really play a critical role if we want to see nuclear energy deployed at scale. That having that safety, having that public trust in the technology is going to be absolutely key. And so they're interested in trying to determine, how can they do their job more effectively and more efficiently? And where are the places, like Niko pointed out, that we can think about trying to change or update regulatory requirements to enable them to do their job better. Let's get rid of the barriers that are unnecessarily slowing them down and keep them really focused on the things that are most important to reactor safety and public health and safety.
So would you guys, I know we that whole maximum credible accident conversation and that kind of way of thinking that was super helpful for you guys to explain it. For those of us watching at home who just want to kind of sort of think of it in terms of megawatts or power, would you kind of sort of tell us how big a unit could be and probably get in this line, so to speak? Like what size units are we probably talking about here in terms of power?
Yeah, so I'll jump in here. I think that really credibly, we could see perhaps a 10 megawatt electric sort of application potentially make its way through this pathway. We could, but alluding to kind of the answer that we got before from Patrick and Niko around sort of why it's this dose limit and not, a direct sort of power level. Yeah. I hope it encourages some future really, really smarter than any of us, nuclear engineer or nuclear engineering or energy development team to come up with some really great or amazing design or safety case or anything and says, hey, this is a 20, 25, 30 megawatt electric reactor that meets this criteria and should be licensed this way. It's going to be really tough, but that's nuclear engineering.
I will completely agree with this point there that I think tens of megawatts, low tens of megawatts is kind of my gut instinct of what might be initially acceptable. But I think, we're really opening the aperture for innovation here. If a company comes in and they've built a better mousetrap that can meet these requirements, then let them take advantage of a regulatory system that really makes sense for them. And so it really is saying, if you can build it, the NRC will review it, and then hopefully we can deploy it. So I really look forward to hopefully in the future if people come up with innovative designs that really let you build big reactors that still meet these safety limits.
We appreciate you taking a stab at that, because I think if without that clarity, people might be tempted to say, oh, well, what you guys are aimed at is we're going to use small nuclear power for data centers. And that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about much smaller applications. And, Brett, I appreciate you putting a number on it, but do you have any specific applications that come to mind just in terms of like how you might see these devices best used or most frequently used?
many of the folk that we talk to a lot around oil and gas applications and industrial applications could think of a lot of uses for, 5 to 10 or 12 years of reliable on demand 10 megawatts, deployable power, especially if it could be regulated and licensed and deployed very, very quickly. And so I think that there's lots of opportunities here. And there's lots of opportunities also to think about how people might use these facilities in conjunction with more of the same facilities. Perhaps there is a data center provider or user out there that likes the idea of buying 10 megawatt reactors or 20 of them for the paradigm they're looking at in the Midwest, currently looking at diesel or other, other expensive options for a more remote data center need or something like that. So it may not be the backbone of what everybody's going to be using to satisfy electricity demand, but it's likely to be satisfying a diverse set of applications.
Yeah, I know we talk a lot about the NRC, and that's great, and we also talk about how fast China is putting up nuclear facilities. But maybe kind of in the realm of things, if you look at sort of Poland or Europe or whatever the case may be, or all these other countries that are also looking to shift back to nuclear, France, for example, what is their process? I mean, what is the NRC's process look versus them? I mean, are we on the same scale? Is the timing issue the same? I mean, what's maybe some differences or some pros and cons of both?
Yeah, it's a little bit challenging when you start talking about international regulation because you kind of come down to two separate things. One, what are kind of the principles and philosophies they're using around the regulation? And two, what are their processes? So I would say on kind of a philosophical level, the big focus is always going to be how do you ensure public health and safety? But some of the differences that you might find are, well, do they want to essentially have a list of requirements that an applicant has to demonstrate compliance with? Or is it more of kind of that general description of prove to me that it's safe? And so what you see in some countries, specifically in France, in the UK, and Canada, is they're more based on this idea of a safety case. Prove to me that it's safe. While in the United States, we currently more have what we call prescriptive regulatory framework, where it's a set of requirements. But like Niko talked about, we're hopefully seeing that change based on both direction from Congress and a recognition that this more performance-based safety case can be better for novel technologies or emerging technologies because it gives you a lot more flexibility. In terms of process, it's going to come down to just what are the different steps that it takes to license a power plant. In some countries, you might have a separate regulatory approval for every single little step. So your licensing process might be made up of 10 or 12 small steps. While in the United States, depending on what licensing pathway you use, you might have 1 or 2 large steps. So I think it's hard to say, okay, is there a best practice out there? But I think when you take a look at nuclear regulation and the quality of the regulatory reviews, the quality of the technical reviews, the NRC is always up there as one of the best regulators internationally. There is a absolutely cliche statement at this point that the NRC is the gold standard of regulation. And we can talk about what that means and what that implies. But I think the NRC's reviews are pretty well afforded. That being said, there are opportunities to think about how they can do their work more efficiently and how taking lessons from other regulators like the UK potentially let them make this transition to more kind of performance-based regulation because they've been doing it for decades. And what lessons have they learned from the process?
And maybe one last question. It's probably an unfair question, but I'll ask it anyways. Obviously, Trump has his 10, executive order for 10 nuclear plants to be sort of under construction by 2030. If you think about where we are today and where we could be by 2030, how much confidence do you guys have that's an achievable type objective?
I'll take that to start. We've been talking here about smaller reactors, but I think there is an interest in all different sizes and types of reactors as well. On the international market, there's a lot of interest in the large gigawatt scale reactors. And so, I know how we look at, the regulatory framework and policy. I know the same for the task force and others, really trying to look across the entire gamut of different technologies and what are those barriers for big reactors as well as smaller reactors. And so, I think when we talk about, meeting that goal, I think the nice part is there are technologies that have a license, specifically the AP1000, the Westinghouse reactor. And so now you have to start looking at what are the different sites that either have licenses or have environmental reviews that are already done, or in many cases, just even have the space for a new reactor. Then you have to start talking about, frankly, I think some of the more challenging questions around financing those
Yeah.
projects, supply chain for especially some of the long lead items like reactor vessel or steam generators. And then, of course, the workforce. And so I think what you really have to think about is that much more holistic look. And a lot of that is outside of the regulatory framework. And so, I think, it's really exciting having that clear direction and goal. But I think it's going to require really all of industry to think, what is it actually going to take to build these in a lot of areas, such as financing, supply chain and workforce, that in many cases might be much more challenging to actually get to that level of scale. Going back as well to the international side, I think it is another good example where Congress has, put a lot of support in, being much more engaged on the international market for building nuclear. There was a provision in the Advance Act that I mentioned specifically for the NRC to be much more active. And I think for countries that are looking to create a regulator, they're going to need help. They're going to want help. And so, how can the NRC be a resource? How can some of those other regulators really be a resource to open up that market? I would say the last thing I'm really excited about is really where you can have that collaboration between regulators. The key example right now is actually between the US and Canada, where Canada is going to be the first, country to build the GE Hitachi BWRX 300 reactor. And there's also an interest in building that here, where the Tennessee Valley Authority, TVA, just submitted a construction permit application to the NRC to also build that reactor. And so, what are those lessons learned going to be between the Canadian regulator and the US regulator? What are those safety findings that the Canadian regulator makes that the NRC can actually incorporate as well? And can you get a much more streamlined review, even if you have some different regulatory frameworks? And so, I think that's another opportunity when we're looking at not just building reactors here in the US, but building reactors globally. How can you really incorporate some of those lessons learned? How can you incorporate some of those safety findings to really, again, make it easier for companies to, be able to build internationally, but also make it a little easier for the regulator to be able to focus on what are the right things, what are the open questions, and not have to repeat all of the work that's already been done.
And Mike, just to shortly answer your question, take it back to your question just a little bit directly, I would just say that we're very lucky that the words were chosen in that executive order the way they were, because it says 10 new reactors under construction by 2030. Well, for some historical reference, Vogtle 3 and 4, the newest reactors built in this country, which came online in the last couple of years, were under construction, quote unquote, in 2008. Their license was issued in 2012. And so there's many years and many steps in the construction of a nuclear power plant. And so to be under construction of 10 large reactors in 5 years, if we are committed and there are sites that are aligned and owners that are aligned, is not out of the realm of possibilities, but don't expect to see a cooling tower.
Okay, so maybe I'll take the glass half full perspective from Brett there. I think 10 by 2030, it's aggressive, but if we really commit to it on the commercial side, I think that's really where you see these conditions start to change. One of the things that people might not know is that there are existing licenses for 6 large reactors, in fact, 6 AP1000s that are still active in the United States. These are places where if the applicant said, we're ready to start building, they've got those licenses ready. And so I think the question is, moving forward, how could the NRC essentially take the experience they have with going through the licensing process, for example, at Vogtle, and say, what does it mean for us to do that again at either an existing nuclear power plant site or a new nuclear power plant site? And I think some of the experience that we've seen both on the reviews of the AP1000s back in the 2000s and 2010s, and the more recent experience with the licensing of advanced reactors gives me some confidence that if we have high quality applicants coming to the table, they've got a clear commercial plan for the reactor, and they leverage an already built technology like the AP1000, I think I think you can make substantial progress or get through the licensing process in the next 5 years. And the question is, are they ready to make those commercial investments and really go forward with it? And so I think if we're going to achieve that 2030 goal, the question is, what else are we doing? Because I don't think if you just set the goal and don't provide any support, I'm not sure if it creates that momentum. But are we aligning all the other factors that are necessary for investors to really say, yep, we're ready to go on this and we're ready to have 10 reactors by 2030?
Guys, just one last question as we wrap up, because I thought it's an interesting moment. The whole premise of your proposal and your paper was, hey, there's a certain category here which we ought to have a separate way of doing things, and we went through all the reasons for that. But then, Brett, when you said, so then you could just buy 10 of them and you could make 100 megawatt, how do you envision something like that happening? Because that suddenly looks like I went to this small window, I got my one thing approved, and then I ordered, a whole bunch of them, and now I basically got 100 megawatts approved. Like how will the bundling provision work? Do you have to have a separate, you're now in the bundling line? Like how would that work?
Well, maybe I'll jump in here real fast, but maybe this is the next paper we work on, gentlemen. But we, a community, the three of us have talked about it for years. There's actually a provision for what we call a manufacturing license, and there's many different ways to think about how you might deploy multiple reactors through a licensed regulatory framework. You could do them piecemeal, one at a time, but you could also pursue this manufacturing license. And there was actually one issued in the early 80s, a consortium between Westinghouse and Newport News Shipbuilding, had close to 1,000 people working for it, the largest indoor gantry crane at a factory that it built on an island off of Jacksonville, Florida. In American history. It was a beautiful piece of technology, just the crane, to build several large offshore reactors, offshore nuclear power plants, large 1,000 megawatt nuclear power plants off the coast of New Jersey. I believe the license was for 4 or 8, gentlemen? Does anybody remember? Of the reactors? Somewhere in between there, a small amount of these number of reactors to be licensed. Nick Turan is going to kill me for not knowing. Of these reactors licensed to roll out of a factory deployment facility with plans for then building breakwaters and constructing these, putting these modules together off the coast of New Jersey. So if we could do that in the 70s and 80s, but then the interest and commercial appetite and the consortium sort of fell apart around it, you could imagine that perhaps the burden today should be easier for somebody to come in and say, hi, I'm going to build a facility to build smaller, easier to mass produce, smaller scale nuclear technology, and I want to pursue a first of a kind manufacturing license to deploy 150 of these, 200 of these, depending on their customer needs, factory process, and order book.
I'll just quickly add, I think a lot of it really comes down to, can applicants think creatively with their customers and with the regulator to determine what's the pathway that makes sense? I think one of the things that can almost be sometimes a little intimidating about the NRC is it can be a little bit of a choose your own adventure book. There are a lot of different regulatory tools available, a lot of different pathways that are available. And if you're clever about understanding what you're prioritizing, what your goals are as a customer, and what's the state of your technology, you can pick the regulatory pathway that can get you to your outcomes faster. You can also simultaneously pick bad decisions and necessarily end up in a little bit of a regulatory rabbit hole that doesn't let you out. And so I think this is something where clear engagement between applicants and customers that are really interested in building 1 to 10 nuclear reactors can work proactively with other experts in the field and the NRC to say, what's the pathway that's going to make sense for us? And how can we do this in a really efficient way? Because again, I think it's in the NRC's interest. They want to work effectively, they want to work efficiently, and they want to play a positive role in trying to think about use of nuclear energy. So how can we work with them to see this as being a positive outcome, as opposed to working in secret and then essentially sliding that application under the door and hoping that everything works out. So it's a lot of it's about this essentially proactive application engagement with the NRC.
Well, guys, it's been fascinating. We've gone the full time, and I bet Mike and I both have another 5 or 10 questions, but we won't do that to you. We know you got to get on about your day. But thank you for joining us. Thank you for being a resource to our community around all these questions. There's a lot happening here, and the space is just fascinating. Like, wow, it's exploding in a good way. No dosage concerns. It's a good explosion. So thank you, guys.
Thank you, Maynard. Thank you, Verdun. Appreciate it.
Yeah, appreciate the opportunity as always. And if you ever want to talk nuclear regulation, I think Niko and I are happy to come back on the show.
Come on down to Houston. Let's have an NRC, everything you ever wanted to know, but we're afraid to ask luncheon. We'll invite all our friends.
I was going to say, don't threaten us with a good time. We'd be happy to join.
Get on down here. Thanks so much, guys. Thanks, everybody.